I'd like to begin with some thanks. First of all, to you, John, for so kindly inviting me and so generously introducing me, my good friend, John. To Assistant Director Michael Loy, who is our host for this evening. This is, to me, a quite unfamiliar mode of interaction, but I'll give it my best shot. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, I'd like to thank my theatron, and that's you, my audience. Kalisperasas, or perhaps it should be more yasas, to your good health in these COVID-ridden times. Wherever you are, whether it is Chios, Mykonos, Athens, or it might be Baltimore, or it might be London, or it might even be Cambridge, who knows? But wherever you are, you're very welcome, and I'm extremely grateful and honored that you have spent this time with me. So I'm going to begin, and I've got a little bit of a text to begin with. I normally don't use a text, I don't like a text, but it'll keep things just a little bit shorter by way of introduction. It's a special thrill for me to be talking to you now in this way, because it so happens it's my own golden jubilee. It was precisely 50 years ago that I first became a student of the British School at Athens. I was then in my first year of doctoral research at the University of Oxford. Well, we all make mistakes. I was under the supervision of then plain Mr. John Boardman, Yannis Pinakanthropos, as he might be in Greek. He's still going strong, 93, he'll be 94 next month. And if memory serves, and my memory is getting a little bit dim, it was pretty much exactly 50 years ago to the day that in the high summer of 1970, I was taking part in a British school dig at Knossos, which John mentioned earlier, on the so-called unexplored mansion site, a dig then co-directed by Hugh Sackett, the late, great Hugh Sackett. Another dear friend of mine, whom I first met on that dig, worked as one of the dig's artists, and she was, again sadly was, Sue Bird. She's no longer with us. So it's to the memory of Sue and of Hugh that I'd like to dedicate this very informal, quite short, 40 minutes or so talk. You've seen the first slide, all about the BSA. Now I move on, I hope, to my first slide, Thebes, the nearly lost city of ancient Greece. Let me just say a few words about my title. It is about Greek Thebes, not the wretchedly homonymous Egyptian one, Egyptian Thebes, the existence of which helps to explain the title of my recent book, which is Thebes, the Forgotten City of Ancient Greece. Now, of course, Greek Thebes was never entirely forgotten, but for 20 years, it was indeed lost between about 335 and 315 BCE. It simply ceased to exist. It was destroyed. I'll come back to that later on. And it has, ancient Greek Thebes has been too often forgotten, partly because of that Egyptian Thebes, very important, the capital of New Kingdom Egypt, but mainly because Athens, Sparta, the Macedon of Philip and Alexander have between them hogged the headlines and the limelight for what passes for ancient Greece. And though Thebes produced some notable cultural figures, and I'll introduce you to some of them later, it never produced a Thucydides or even a Xenophon. And Xenophon was not alone, I'm afraid, among his Athenian compatriots in being a bit of a Thebes hater. So the Athenian slur that Thebans were merely Boeotian pigs, interested only in scoffing Copaic eels, eels from Lake Copais. That slur has tended to stick. One of the aims of my book, therefore, is to try to correct that imbalance, that misperception. And that brings me to my final prefatory remark. Thebes, my Thebes, was not just one city, but two. It was both the city of history and the city of myth. What have the Thebans, one might ask, ever done for us? Well, not many of us will instantly think of the city of history. And for example, Epaminondas, who perhaps is my own history hero, the great liberator. But many surely will think of Dionysus, Heracles, Oedipus, Antigone, the Magnificent Seven, that is the Magnificent Seven against Thebes, and in other words, the city of myth. So, onto the slideshow. I begin with, broadly speaking, Aegean Greece, just to set the scene. I shan't be going very far outside that particular part of the Mediterranean, that particular part of the ancient Greek world. But just to recall, ancient Greece, of course, the word Greece comes from those Romans, not from the Greeks. They were Hellenes, inhabited Hellas, and Hellas was a cultural concept. Hellas was wherever Hellenes lived, and they lived by the 5th century BC, pretty much all round the Mediterranean, all round the Black Sea. And later, following the conquests of Alexander the Great, they were, of course, going to expand even further east, as far east as what's now Pakistan, Afghanistan, northwest India, that sort of thing. So the Greek world was much, much bigger than just what you see on the screen, Aegean Greece. So let's home in a little bit, and I apologize if you need a magnifying glass really to look at the map on your right, but you get a very good idea from the map on your left of where Boeotia or Boeotia lies within mainland, or Steria as it's sometimes called, Hellas. And so we're talking about a region that abuts central Greece, that it is on the northwest frontier, as it were, of Attica. And there was a phrase, an Attic neighbor, an Athenian neighbor, meaning a very bad neighbor. Well, the Thebans, the Boeotians, and the Athenians from Attica very often, by and large, were not good neighbors. The term Boeotia, what's the etymology of it? Well, one suggestion is that it might be derived from bous, so something to do with oxen, something to do with pasturage. And that, I think, suggests quite well the economic richness of this circa 3,000 square kilometer area, which in antiquity had as its main geographical feature something which no longer exists. You go there today, you don't see it because it's been drained. And it's the aforementioned Lake Copais, which, if you look at the map on your right, you'll see an arrow. It's pretty much pointing to Lake Copais. And the key point of difference is this, that rather like soccer is a game of two halves, Boeotia was a region of two sub-regions, as it were, north and south. And they were divided by Lake Copais. And corresponding to two regions or sub-regions were two major cities. And the one that I'm dealing with is the southeastern one of the two, that is Thebes. But way back in the distant past, and not all that distant past somehow, also in historical times to some extent, the other major city of Boeotia was Orchomenos. And there's a rather interesting detail concerning Orchomenos as opposed to Thebes. And I'm now going to move on, and I'm going to start if you like, chronologically or ideologically between my two cities. In other words, between the city of myth and the city of history. And so we're looking here at a map of Mycenaean, that is late Bronze Age in archaeological terms, Greece. And underlined are the major towns, cities, whatever you like to call them, ones which either had palaces, which were literate in the sense they had an administrative archival script that is indeed the earliest form of ancient Greek to survive. We unromantically call it Linear B, and was the cities were also adorned with major cemetery sites, including in particular tholos tombs, those beehive tombs, the famous ones, the so-called treasury of Atreus at Mycenae is, I suppose, one of the most well-known, but also Orchomenos had a huge tomb of that sort, a beehive tholos tomb. Thebes itself had a palace, and I'm going to move on to show you the sorts of things that came out of the palace archives when the site was excavated, as it was various points during the 20th century. And so these accidentally burnt because they were not baked originally. They were burnt when the palace, which the writing and the administrative documents served, was itself burned, circa late 13th century in the high 1200s BC or BCE. Something like 250 either whole or partial fragments of Linear B tablets have been excavated in Thebes. Just on passing, let me mention that the most recent palace sites so found, in other words, found through Linear B tablets initially before excavation subsoil began, is the one near Sparta. And everyone thought, well, the Mycenaean Late Bronze Age palace of Sparta, that must be somewhere near where modern Sparta is, I mean, very near. And so there's been a lot of excavating just to the southeast of the town, where the town now is. But actually, it turns out it was 12 kilometers or so, pretty much due south of Sparta, a place called Agios Vasilios, St. Basil being the name of the local chapel. So anyway, that's by the way, but there'll be a point you'll see shortly why I mentioned that find. Amongst the tablets is one that mentions the way in which the Greeks spelt the name Thebans in Mycenaean Greek. And another one, quite strikingly, uses a form of the ancient Greek word for Sparta, which is Lacedaemon. Sparta is a geographical term in historical times. Lacedaemon is a political as well as a geographical descriptor. This tablet tells us from Thebes that already the word was in some sort of currency. This particular tablet, though, I'm emphasizing the economic dimension here. It has two particular aspects, as you'll see. Some of the items catalogued here are recording grain because it's in a granary, and the Latin for the kind of grain is far. And the other thing that is being recorded here is wool. And those, by and large, are the two main economic substances, namely animals of a certain sort, oxen in this case, or sheep in this case, and on the other hand, various types of grain, including spelt. But those of you who are clued up on the mythical origins of Thebes will know that the Mycenaean city was not, of course, the first city of Thebes. It wasn't the first inhabitation. There were people living on that site way back in prehistory, but it first becomes a measurably substantial city with a palace, with walls, with major graves and linear, all that stuff together in the late Bronze Age. But the ancient Greeks themselves had a myth historical, and this is, of course, the Theban historical account of their own city's origins, and they believed it had been founded by not a Greek. I mean, I wonder how many other Greek cities claimed quite proudly to have a non-Greek founder. And the guy's name was Kadmos. He came from Tyre in today's Lebanon, what the Greeks called Phoenicia, though we actually don't know what the Phoenicians called themselves. But they also thought that he had something to do with introducing writing. And that was, of course, exciting when we found actual bits of writing from Thebes amongst the earliest examples of extant Greek writing. Anyhow, I move on from the palace to one of the finds from that palace area. And Kadmos allegedly founded Thebes because he was chasing his sister, who just happened to be called Europa. And it's from Europe that the continent which John mentioned right at the beginning, Europe, takes its name. So Europe is named after an Asiatic. There's an irony. Anyway, as the caption says on this slide, these two heraldic sphinxes on a late Mycenaean ivory toilette box, elephant ivory, imported therefore, and a pyxis is an article typically of feminine accoutrement, came from the Kadmos, which was the name the Thebans gave after their mythical founder to their Acropolis, a huge Acropolis, not so much because of its height, like the one of Athens, the Acropolis, Acropolis, but because of its not only being elevated above the plain, but it spread for quite a way. It was a really big, substantial thing. And if you go to Thebes today, well, there it is. It's the same Acropolis. It hasn't been diminished in any way. That is, and always was, where when Thebes became a city, a town, it had as its administrative and other habitation centre. People lived round the foot of the Kadmos, or actually on the Kadmos itself. I'll just dwell briefly on the sphinxes. This is an Egyptian motif, imported by the Greeks. And it's one of those ironies of history. We've got quite a few so far, but the earliest attestation outside Greece of the name Thebes does seem to be in Egypt, and that might even be earlier, from Amarna in the 14th century BC. At any rate, they imported the Sphinx, but they added wings. And so you get this combination of a sort of bird-like figure, an eagle, if you like, with a lion. And that's a peculiarly Greek spin, or Theban spin, on an originally Egyptian motif. Well, now, as I've already mentioned, the reason the Linear B tablets survive is they were burnt accidentally, in the sense that they were burnt with the palace that was burnt in the later 13th century BC, shortly before 1200, if you like. And what followed in Thebes and Boeotia, and in actually many parts of southern Greece, it's a controversial term now for some, was dark in relation to, that is, a relationally dark age. Scholars differ as to when they begin it, and they fight amongst themselves as to just how dark was it. But the area that I did my research with under John Boardman still is, I would say, one of those that wholly justifies the term Dark Age. If you compare 13th century Laconia and Agios Vasilios now, and the region around it, with, let's say, 11th century Laconia, well, there's just no comparison. Smaller, tiny, much smaller, many fewer settlements, the assemblages, the artifactual horizon, infinitely poorer than it had been in the 13th century. On the other hand, there is an upside, and this is, if you look at it from the other end of the telescope, as it were, it was also the beginning of the Iron Age, sometime in the 11th, 10th centuries, BC, especially in Attica and the offshore island of Evia, Euboea. There was a terrific leap forward, a shift from bronze to iron as the basic material for the basic classes of cutting tools. And that, of course, leads on to all sorts of consequences in Iron Age society. But What I'm going to start off with you, and I'm now having leapt from the 13th century, where my last item came from, to the 8th century BC, as we see circa 735 BC. This is what some people call the Greek Renaissance. So after the Dark Age, things start to pick up in the 9th century, and they really take off in the 8th century. One of the manifestations of Renaissance being the acquisition of a new script. And again, as with the Sphinx motif, borrowed from the Orient, indeed like Kadmos, borrowed from the Phoenicians, but with a spin, and the spin was crucial, that the Greeks, who invented a fully phonetic alphabetic script, they borrowed Phoenician signs for vowels, which the Phoenicians didn't use. They didn't, all Semitic scripts, early Semitic scripts, dispensed with signs for vowels. The Greeks wanted them, and so they took over signs for sounds the Greeks didn't have and applied them to vowels. And so you get the first fully phonetic alphabetic scripts from, well, people differ, circa 750 perhaps would be widely accepted. And some people think there's a direct connection with the Homeric poems, in the sense that you could now, in principle, write the whole damn thing down, all, as it were, 24 books of the Iliad and 24 of the Odyssey. But regardless, the alphabet was a huge leap forward. Well, another leap forward, it doesn't seem it if you look at this one, is the depiction of human figures, which, like much else, disappeared in the early Dark Age from the Greek world pretty much everywhere. And secondly, the application of paint to the depiction of myth, that is, specific versions of particular myths. Well, now this pot was made in Athens. I've put it Attica on the screen, but it was found in Thebes, and it's obviously from a tomb because it's pretty much a whole pot. And guess where it is now? It's in the British Museum. Well, quite a lot of stuff ends up in the British Museum, doesn't it? Anyway, here you see a warship, two superimposed banks of oarsmen, presumably the artist's suggestion of actually two rows side by side. And so probably what we're dealing with, you can see a bit of a cutter at one end, sort of proto-ram, is a warship of the second half of the 8th century BC, of the type which the Greeks called a pentacontal, so a 50-oared warship. Now, the interest for me, for us, City of Myth, we're in Thebes. Is there any specific connection to the particular individuals, a man and a woman? The man is encouraging the woman, or is he, well, a polite term is abducting. A tougher one would be raping, which is what Zeus was alleged to have done to Europa in the myth of origin of the city of Thebes. Anyway, is this a scene that we can identify from the repertoire of, broadly speaking, early Greek myth? So is it Paris taking Helen on board the ship, which is either taking him from Githyon to Troy or from somewhere else? Or is it Theseus with Ariadne behind him? Or is it Menelaus at Troy, grabbing Helen and taking her back with him to the Peloponnese and eventually to Sparta? Who knows? But anyway, it's rather a fine piece. It's a kratia, it's a wine mixing bowl, and I remind you that Thebes is, among other things, the city of Dionysus, the god of, among other things, wine, as well as metamorphosis and shape-shifting and theatre and whatever else. So we've come down into the later 8th century. I've now moved on into the early 7th century BC. And this is bronze, of course. It's not iron or ivory, but it is solid cast, cire perdu bronze. And it mirrors the sort of elongated, geometrically formed figures one sees in 2 dimensions on the pots, such as I showed you just in the last slide. But of course, our friend here is 3-dimensional. And he speaks to us, which is what's rather lovely. If you've not got your images covering the inscription on the right-hand side of your screen, what I've done is chosen a slide which shows you graphically how the writer of this, the incisor, the engraver of this message, and it's as it were a mantiklos, is speaking, and he says he's dedicating this figurine himself, in a sense, to the far shooter, the silver-bowed far shooter. So that's Apollo. And Apollo was one of the major gods of historical Thebes. And I'm going to come on to another sanctuary of Apollo not far from Thebes quite shortly. And he offers it, it's a classic Greek, do what days I give in order that you may give. It's, I scratch your back, Apollo, you scratch mine. He wants something in return, and it's not specified what. It might be symbolic, charis, it might be honor, prestige, or it might be he wants his support in some particular enterprise, whether war or some other economic function. The elevation and the elegance of the figure is what I'd like you to concentrate on for the moment. Remembering that slur against the Thebans as Boeotians, all Boeotians are swine. They don't really have an aesthetic bone in their body, is what the Athenians are saying. Not so. I invite you to look at this gentleman here. He's clearly an aristocrat, Mantiklos, and his name is probably something related to mantis, which means a kind of seer, someone who inspects the entrails of slaughtered victims, animals, and then foretells the either immediate future or a longer term future. And the final point I want to make about this particular figurine is, does he represent Apollo? In other words, does Mantiklos cast himself, or rather does the bronze caster cast Mantiklos, the dedicator, as if he were a kind of Apollo? In other words, is he holding a bow? Was he originally himself holding a bow in his left hand with a spear? The right arm has gone altogether. I just leave you with that thought. I mentioned that I was going to introduce you to another Apollo shrine in Boeotia. It's about 11 kilometers from Thebes, and it's called the Ptoion because this is a melding of Apollo with a local hero. So the local hero is Ptoios, and it's Apollo Ptoios. And this site, which is absolutely wonderful, you have to go up a hairpin climb to get to it, and then you see opening out. It's excavated by the French. And the site yielded, I find this quite hard to believe, but this is what we're reliably told, no fewer than 100 plus of these naked male, frontally posed, very Egyptianizing in origin, but they become less so as time goes on, 6th century BC, Kouroi, and the name Kouros means boy or youth, typically later adolescent rather than earlier adolescent. And so rather as with Mantiklos, one asks, what did the dedicator of this, who is anonymous in this case, and there is no inscription to go with it, partly because in this case he's actually not totally preserved. In some cases there might have been a base. What did the dedicator see in this image? Was it an image of Apollo? Was it an image of himself as a worshipper of Apollo? But anyway, it's reckoned to take about a year of a stonemason, a stone sculptor, craftsman's life, working life, to create a life-size marble, in this case, statue in this form. So 100 plus in existence or found, rescued in various states of preservation, tells us this was a wealthy local community, very much so. And there's been a bit of a flurry of excitement recently because Herodotus clearly visited this shrine, and there is actually a reference by him to a particular dedication, and it may be that we have found the actual dedication that Herodotus himself looked at. I mean, it's one of those moments where history in the form of literature, in the form of the preserved text of Herodotus, comes together with an actual artifact that one can look at in front of one. It may be that there is a disconnect, but it's possible that there is a conjunction there. So that is, if you like, early historical or archaic Thebes for you. And I note finally that this particular course, like all the others, is in the wonderful, magnificent, new Thebes Museum, and I very much regret I was going to visit it and then lockdown occurred, but I have not yet myself visited the new Museum of Thebes. I knew the old one quite well, and I visited that, and there is a very good guide to the old museum by my friend Katie Dimarkopoulou, who was once in control of the museum there and then went on to become director of the National Archaeological Museum. She was a fellow graduate student of mine, actually in Oxford, a student of Hector Catling. But I move on to look at now the Thebes of the city of myth. And I'll have to go a little bit more quickly now. This is an early 4th century BC, BCE, South Italian, that is from Magna Graecia. It was made there. And it depicts Antigone standing before Creon, her uncle. And she is the both daughter and the sister, half-sister of Oedipus. And this is the sort of myth that Athenians, both on stage and in visual art, seem to have unusually relished. I might even say they appropriated. So Thebes itself had its own mythical traditions going way back. And for example, of the early epics, there were 4 Theban epics, quite separate from the Iliad and the Odyssey and other Trojan War epics. There were specifically Theban, but they've all not survived. Why? Because other traditions were deemed to be more, for whatever reason, important or more worth preserving. So the South Italians, the real South Italians who used vases like this, they actually loved theatre. And they, probably the very earliest South Italian vase painters actually had been trained in Athens. At any rate, they brought a very Athenian idiom with them when they came and worked, or when they were trained, when they were taught by masters in South Italy. And so you get vases such as this. Now, going back almost a century or so, back into the 5th century BC, this is indeed Athenian made. It's one of those exceptionally fancy export pots. It's a write-on in terms of its form, which means it's something from which you pour wine. But it's an embodied, well, very Theban Sphinx with the fancy wings and so on. Above, in the red figure technique, are scenes of Athenian myth. So it's a classic case, I think, of Athenian appropriation of Theban myth and motif. And this was exported to South Italy and is actually in a museum there, local museum, and it's attributed to a man, either he was called Sotides, the man who painted it as well as potted it, or the Sotides painter made it and painted it, and or Sotides potted it, and someone else whose name we don't know painted. Anyway, Sotides, very, very famous, long oeuvre, and this is a terrifically symbolic, significant piece in its own right from a very rich South Italian tomb. A little bit a little bit later, yes, the 3rd quarter of the 5th century probably, is a scene, red figure, Attic, on a shape called a licanis, And a lycanis was a small, shallow bowl with a lid, and like a pyxis, it served as a toilette box. And so, since it was a woman's item of use, comes from a grave, of course, which is why it survives as it does. Why would an Athenian woman find pleasing a scene such as this, where two, well, I hesitate to call them ladies, are tearing apart? I mean, they are pulling apart a young naked, a younger, at any rate, naked male. And I think the standard interpretation of this, the iconographic interpretation, though there are no labels, of it as Agave and Ino tearing apart Agave's son, Pentheus, is probably the correct interpretation. But in 450 to 425 BC, suppose we had only literary evidence to go on. We wouldn't actually be calling the unfortunate in the middle there Pentheus. We would be calling him Tentheus, because that is the name that survives in only a couple of written sources before, and you're all, of course, immediately thinking Euripides' Bacchae, because these are bacchantes. If the myth is correctly identified, the iconography is correct. This is when Agave, blind, enthusiastic, shall we say, drunk with Dionysus in some sense, thinks she's tearing apart a wild animal, but actually she's tearing apart and starting to eat her own son. Sparagmos, omophagia, really horrendous things. Why would an Athenian mother take pleasure in looking at this? Perhaps because she would automatically say, typical, just what Thebans do, how they murder their own children. Well, who knows? That may be the case. Certainly it's the case, and I'll come back to this, that at that period, in the third quarter of the 5th century, Athens and Thebes, the real Athens and Thebes, were at daggers drawn. They were deeply inimical. And I'll just end with the thought that perhaps it was Euripides who invented the name Pentheus, correcting the traditional Tentheus, because Pentheus gave him a pun. Penthos is the Greek for grief, and certainly Agave was deeply aggrieved, and Pentheus suffered a great deal of grief. My final one in this tranche is in terms of, in other words, the appropriation or the imbrication of the theatre at Athens, the iconography of Athenian vases with Thebes. And I end with this, the pronomos vase. Now, many of you will already have known this before I did. I knew all about the pronomos vase. Terrific series of essays were published on it, actually, in Oxford in the 90s. And I owe this picture, by the way, to my friend Francois Lissarag in Paris. But when I was writing my book, which I knocked off in its first draft in something like 54 days, and of course it takes many, many more days to actually rub it together and put it together and make it into a finished product. Anyway, I suddenly discovered that pronomos was Theban, whereas I'd assumed if you have a theatrical cast on an Athenian pot, this is an Attic red-figured volute crater of the last quarter of the 5th, first quarter of the 4th, well, it must be, everybody must be, mustn't they, Athenian? No, because Pronomos was, as it happens, the most famous, he was, as it were, the Sir James Galway, the Jimmy Galway of his day, the most famous auletes of all Hellas, and the Thebans were rightly proud that he was a Theban, but he was so skilled that he would be hired by an Athenian chorigos to play the aulos at his, and then he would be financing this chorigos, a satyr drama. And it's slightly odd to our way of thinking, but satyr dramas were always appended to tragedies. So in other words, a comic dramatist did not write a satyr drama. Satyrs are the mates of the accompaniments of Dionysus. This tells you instantly we're in a play, we're in a Dionysiac scene. And there is Pronomos sitting on his rather magnificent throne with his double aulos, being feted and celebrated as being the greatest Aulites of his day. And he was a Theban, so much for Boeotian swine. Now, very, very briefly, and I do apologize for this sort of sudden jerk from nice pictures of theatre and dancing and music and drunkenness and so on, to the sordidness of Ares, the money changer of souls. This is war. Because, and the period which we call the classical, circa 500 to 320, or if you like, circa 480 to 330. People differ on where you draw the lines. In the classical period, for the Thebans, it began dreadfully and it ended dreadfully. And one of the reasons, it's one of the supporting reasons why Thebes has tended to be forgotten. When you're thinking back, wow, great ancient Greece was, what did they do there? Oh dear, in 480 BC, Thebes then, as for a long time after, ruled by an oligarchy, a small elite of rich Theban citizens, decided when faced with the choice between the mainly southern Greek alliance headed by Sparta and Athens, resisting the Persian invasion led by Xerxes, which is of course trying to punish Athens for having defeated his father's forces at Marathon, and to punish Athens for having had the rash temerity to intervene in the Persian sphere and actually burn one of the Persians' major western citadels in Sardis, in Lydia. Well, massive amphibious invasion, 480 BC. The Greeks knew it was coming, but only circa 32 out of what, 700 in the Aegean Greek area, only that few managed, and this was the few, but it was a few of a rather sad sort, I think, managed to cobble together an alliance to resist. Well, Thebes thought it was bound to lose the loyalist resistance. So if you're not going to win, you might as well make the best of it. And they went over to the Persian side, thereby earning an undying reputation as having once been traitors to Hellas. 140 odd years later, Alexander the Great takes over from his dad, Philip, and I'm going to come to the circumstances very shortly. Major battle is fought. Thebans lose to Alexander, to Philip. A couple of years later, Thebes being under a Macedonian garrison, it's really been given a hard time by the Macedonians, decides it's had enough, and Thebes revolts, only to be crushed utterly. And on what grounds did Alexander justify his decision to not just treat the Thebans harshly, punish them, kill a few hundred, enslave a few hundred more and so on, but actually to physically destroy pretty much the entirety of the city, with just some exceptions? I'll come back to that, but a few exceptions. His justification? Because the Thebans had been traitors to Hellas 140 odd years before, and he, Alexander, was about to go off to Asia in the name of the Hellenes to hammer the Persians as reprisal for their, that is Xerxes, invasion and destruction, especially of Athens, all those years before. Anyway, during the 5th century, in the immediate aftermath of the, in fact, victory by the loyalist Greeks, Thebans were indeed punished. They were treated harshly by loyalist Greeks, and the Athenians, some years later, took the opportunity to invade, to conquer, to occupy the whole of Boeotia. So quite extraordinary. For a decade, Athens was not just a kind of naval power, fighting the Persians by sea and developing a large alliance, 200 odd cities of mainly island and littoral towns and cities, but they also for 10 years conquered, dominated Boeotia, including therefore Thebes. Well, defeat eventually, 447, a place called Coronea, liberated the Thebans, who very quickly saw that their future, their immediate future, lay with Sparta, Athens' developing enemy. And so it was as allies of Sparta that when Sparta began the Greco-Peloponnesian War, the Atheno-Peloponnesian War, if you like, kind of world war in ancient Greek terms, the Boeotians, as the Thebans spoke of themselves, regarded themselves, because Thebes was head of a federal state, an oligarchic federal state. So Thebes weren't just the Thebans, but they were the dominant power of the Boeotians, which is how the Boeotian federal state was referred to. The Boeotians allied with Sparta, and they did very well indeed out of what Thucydides called the one Peloponnesian War. It was probably two major phases of warfare, separated by quite a long interval of a phony war and only desultory sort of fighting. Anyway, in the first phase, the 10 years war, 431 to 421, one of the major battles took place within Boeotia at a place called Delion on the east coast, just opposite Euboea, Evia. And it's thought that this gentleman here, Saugenes, who came from Tanagra, another of the Boeotian cities, and was buried and had this rather nice tombstone erected within the top of funerary banqueting scene. Then his name, then presumably there he is with his shield and his short sword, set up at Tanagra. It's thought that Saugenes could very well have been one of the casualties of the Battle of Delion, which the Boeotians, the Thebans, won over the Athenians. Well, eventually, the Spartan alliance, largely due actually to Persian money, as well as to the alliance of the Thebans and others, the Peloponnesian League, which they themselves headed, won the Atheno-Peloponnesian War, and for the next 40 odd years were the dominant, or one of the most dominant powers in the Greek mainland until, and it's an extraordinarily complex series of causes and sub-causes and variables and so on, which I had to go, it's now what, 35 years ago, at trying to explain in a book called Agesilaus and the Crisis of Sparta. That came out in 1987. Well, eventually, for various internal, external causes, Sparta became weaker and weaker until in 371 BC, and you'll see at the top of the slide, that's the start date for this so-called Theban hegemony, a famous golden decade of Theban power, not just in its own backyard, that is central Greece, but actually Thebes being the dominant power in all mainland Greece, and to some extent taking on the mantle of first Sparta, then Athens, even going over to Persia and conducting high diplomacy, etc., etc. At any rate, it started off with a major defeat for the Spartans at a place called Leuctra in Boeotia. And between 371 and 362, when again the Spartans were defeated, but this time down in the Peloponnese, in other words, the Thebans had taken the fight to the Spartans, down in Mantinea, Mantinea being one of the allies of Sparta in the Peloponnesian League, not always a wholly reliable one. Anyway, during that period, Thebes, as now I argue, not everybody agrees with me, having a form of democracy for the first time, which they extended to the entire federal state, minus, interestingly, Orchomenos. Orchomenos had revolted from the Boeotians and gone over to the Spartans and remained there until it was forcibly returned by the Boeotians under Thebes. For that decade, two Thebans were the prime movers. Plutarch, himself a Boeotian, famous biographer, 1st, 2nd century CE AD, wrote biographies of both these two, Pelopidas and Epameinondas. Sadly, the biography of Epaminondas is one of those, I think, 4 only of his biographies not to survive. However, since Pelopidas was an exact contemporary and a kind of sidekick, we learn a good deal about Epaminondas indirectly through the biography of Pelopidas by Plutarch. Raleigh, Sir Walter Raleigh, writing his History of the World in the Tower of London, believed that Epaminondas was the greatest of all the ancient Greeks. And that's quite something if you think he was up against such as Alexander, such as Pericles, about whom I'm going to be speaking tomorrow in another venue. At any rate, I happen to share that view. I'm very fond of Epaminondas. We don't know enough about him, but he apparently wasn't very fussed about what he wore. He was much more interested in what he thought. And he never married, it seems. He may have been a preferred gay. That's an interesting thought, because the Boeotians, and especially the Thebans, privileged forms of homosociality and homosexuality, including founding an entire regiment of, as it were, homosexual couples, 300 or 150 couples, all adults. Quite an extraordinary thing. And they were given, or they took for themselves, a rather remarkable title, which is sacred band, as if they were in some sense above the normal run of ordinary Thebans. This was a dedicated body in some sense. Anyway, with the sacred band, Pelopidas, Epaminondas won these 2 great battles. And Epaminondas was a federalist, a convinced federalist. So when he went down into the Peloponnese to undo Spartan control for good, he did 2 major things. One was to liberate the Helots. Helots were this subclass, the underclass, the slave class of the Spartans, a class that was reproduced by natural reproduction. In other words, they're not imported slaves, these are Greeks. Helots have been slaves, their fathers, their grandfathers, going right back to the 8th or 7th century BC, hundreds of years. At a stroke, 370, 369, Epaminondas liberates them. A few years later, he is the prime mover behind the foundation of another new city. I should have said that the city that Epaminondas helps found as a result of the liberation of the Helots is that of Mycenae. He then, and it's on your map just above, Megalopolis is founded in 368, a federal capital for all the Arcadians. So this is getting away from polis particularism, new cities. We're still within the world of cities, the polis, but nevertheless, new forms of polis for new citizens. This is a terrific renewal. We owe, or the Greeks owe, to Epaminondas. And when he died, he had no natural children. And so he says, I leave my 2 daughters, they're my legacy, Mycenae, Megalopolis, which in Greek are in the feminine gender. So, Epaminondas, that's on a high. During the period of Boeotian federal state domination in the 4th century BC, they issued a common coinage, and I just select this particular one on the left, characteristic Boeotian shield. This is the particular kind of shield associated with the Boeotians as an emblem. It looks as if bits have been bitten out of either side of the central disc. And on the right, Thes is short for, as the caption says, Thespiae. And I mention that partly because there was a famous shrine to Eros, sexual love, the son of Aphrodite in Greek myth, and possibly the sort of cult that the members of the sacred band would have been particularly keen on fostering, on devoting and dedicating themselves to. But I move on quickly, we're almost at the end, to a rather sad, though of course the Thebans, when they set this up, set it up proudly. because this is the so-called Lion of Chaeronea. Chaeronea or Chaeronea is where that battle I mentioned that the Thebans lost to Alexander the Great and Philip his father, when the Thebans, a democracy, fought with the other great 4th century Greek democracy, Athens, trying to, as they saw it, resist the autocracy, the form of regime that the Macedonians under Philip enjoyed or had, which democratic Greeks, especially the Athenians, chose to believe was a form of slavery. And therefore they rose up against Macedonian control, and they were very heavily defeated. When Thebes was resuscitated, as I said, after about 20 years of annihilation, 335 to 315, it's thought that it was then that this particular monument was put up to what had been, in fact, a defeat for the Thebans. But this monument was very near to the graves, side by side, which have been excavated, of some 254 Theban warriors. And it is thought that they are the surviving corpses, the remains of the 300 sacred band that fought its last, and of course it was wiped out to a man, battle at Chaeronea. Now, I've left myself very little time for post-classical Thebes, the reception of Thebes. I put on the screen what is, again, from Tanagra. That's the main source of production of these rather charming Boeotian terracotta female figurines, demurely dressed. And I illustrate it really because though Thebes was resuscitated, 315, it never achieved anything like the power and the success, the éclat of its classical predecessor. I move on to penultimate slide, which is an image by Ingres, who among other things was, as it were, Napoleon's court painter. And it shows a rather handsome, of course, pensive and quizzical Oedipus, suitably naked in the ancient Greek manner, quizzing, in fact, answering a question put to him by the dreaded Sphinx, who, as we'll all know from Sophocles' Oedipus, the king of about 430 BC, when Athens was actually suffering a real plague. Thebes is supposedly under plague, and it's Oedipus who, not realizing that he is a Theban, he thinks he's Corinthian, he comes along, having killed his dad, he answers the riddle of the Sphinx, and on the basis of that rids the Thebans of the plague that the Sphinx had been spreading. He becomes king of Thebes. There's an awful lot packed into this one image, and I merely add that a copy of it hung on the wall of the studio of a certain Sigmund Freud in northwest London, very near his psychoanalytic couch. And so this is one way in which Oedipus still informs an ancient Theban mythical figure, modern understandings of human psychodynamics, controversial though they of course are. And finally, a favorite of mine, this is a costume design by Leon Bakst, and perhaps you can see behind me two prints. They're also by Leon Bakst, who with Serge Diaghilev founded and ran the Ballet Russe from 1909 to 1927. And Bakst, in this instance, 1911, took a Boeotian myth, Narcissus, in a Latin form, and made it the basis for a ballet of which he was both the designer and the director. And it was called, because it was always French in those days, Narcisse, 1911. And on that relatively joyous note of dancing and abandon and indeed nudity, I say, if you have been, thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Of course, for that wonderfully vivid evocation of myth and history of Thebes, with a little bit of reception thrown at the end for good measure. There would normally, of course, have been a resounding peel as you finish. But in the virtual world, we don't have that. But you can be reassured, perhaps, that or heartened by the fact that the applause would come from, as I noted it, from the chat. So not everyone. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, USA, UK, Greece, Turkey, Oman, Russia, Romania, Germany, Sweden, and Poland. So
wow,
international audience. So just a reminder that we've been collecting your questions as we go along, and I'll pose those to Paul over the next 30 minutes or so. We may not get to all of them, but we'll do our best. And of course, if we don't get to your question, you can always find the answer in Paul's book, Thebes, the Forgotten City. I'm sure that it only took him 54 days to write, he tells us. The easiest way to handle questions is for me to read them out and for Paul to answer orally so that everyone can both hear the question and hear the answer. And I'll start with a sort of very basic one, and that is, how is it that Thebes in Greece and Thebes in Egypt have the same name?
I was afraid someone was going to ask that. Can you hear me all right, first of all? Yeah, of course, Thebes is a Greek name. The Egyptians called it something else. But very early on, even in Homer, there is a reference to a Thebes in Egypt. And indeed, it's a comparison to the disbenefit of Greek Thebes, because whereas the Egyptian one is said to have 100 gates, hekatopylon, the Greek one merely has 7. And of course, that's the famous myth of Kadmos founds Thebes, he sows dragon's teeth, and up spring dragon men, they're the first inhabitants of Thebes. He has walls built, and Zethos and Amphis are around. One's playing, one's actually doing literally the heavy lifting, and Thebes is said to be endowed with 7 gates in its substantial fortifications. And it was really in the Hellenistic, the post-Alexander period, when, of course, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, that many Greek cities, or rather, I put it another way, there weren't that many new foundations. There are only 2 absolutely new Greek foundations in Hellenistic Egypt, but the Greek names were applied and then became, as it were, standard to Egyptian cities. So I think it's something like Wasret was the Egyptian name for Thebes. It's modern Luxor, then becomes called Thebes. And so if you go to Egypt now, you get the word Thebes, and Tutankhamun is said to be ruling in, that period. The new kingdom of Egypt has its capital, not at Memphis, but at Thebes and so on. So that's where the confusion arises, but it's very, very early.
Slightly related question, do you know where the name Thebes comes from?
No, I couldn't discover that etymologically. Perhaps somebody has a thought about that. I did look into that, but I'm not sure that it's clear.
Yeah, of course, it's Tekwa in Linear B, but
yeah,
which only tells us it's Tegwan, so Tegwai or something like that. On the Sphinx, someone asks whether you have a sense of why the Greeks not only added wings, but changed it from male to female.
Yes, and added a tail and all sorts of things. I'm afraid to say this is, well, if I use the word misogyny, it's a little bit strong, but it's long been pointed out that just about every monster, every creature that does something nasty to humans. Let's take in the Odyssey, Scylla and Charybdis. These are all female. There is just a sort of generic assimilation of the feminine to the terrifying. And a friend of mine, exact contemporary of mine, Ruth Badal, wrote an article about 40 years ago, really, on this very point, that the feminine, the female, seems to have been a model for to males of what one wishes to avoid, that which is in some way terrifying, which is dinos and dinon in a bad way. So that is entirely consonant with all the other repertoire of Greek monsters. Is that an adequate response?
Sure. Question about an ancient Greek proverb: not everything that is in Athens is in Boeotia. Does it refer more to the Boeotia of history or the Boeotia of myth? Or
I think both, but I'd need to be told, is that a modern proverb? Or is
ancient Greek proverb?
It's an ancient Greek proverb, and does it pitch up in a collection of paroimia, proverbs, or was it actually cited in as the Boeotian swine, Canar, was cited by somebody I didn't actually find time to mention, Pindaros. It's possible that he was actually born in a village called Kainos Heads of the Dog, not Thebes city itself, but he is a Theban in every other sense by adoption. And he, in his, I think it's Olympian 6, refers to that. So it's already proverbial by the first half of the 5th century BC. So I'd be interested to know whether that is a very early proverb or whether it's one of these much later collections which you're never quite sure of the authenticity, the origins of.
Well, here we're victims of the format that, of course, I can't answer you back, but if an answer comes back as we're speaking, I'll let you know. Question about Epaminondas and Pelopidas. Do you think the political structure of Thebes limited the effectiveness of Epaminondas and Pelopidas during their hegemony?
Well, interesting. I mean, this is something that it's in a way a support for my view that in 3798, when Thebes was liberated from Spartan direct control, they actually put a garrison in, and it was Pelopidas who from outside, as an exile, led a band of Theban exiles, collaborating obviously with forces inside to overthrow the Spartan regime. Pelopidas and Epaminondas, I believe, then instituted, or helped to institute, usher in a reform of the constitution, which for the previous 60 odd years had been a form of oligarchy, as I mentioned, a moderate form since the middle 5th century, since the 440s, as opposed to what seems to be the extreme form that the Thebans had in 480-479. And it was partly because Thebes in the 4th century was for the first time a kind of democracy that, as at Athens, precisely as at Athens, the higher you rose as an individual, the more likely you were to arouse enmity, jealousy, and to be knocked down, knocked off your perch. Pericles was exceptional at Athens, not in being attacked constantly by enemies and who tried to knock him down, but in not being knocked down. In other words, he was able somehow to rise above all the various ways in which his Athenians tried to get at him, to pull him down a peg or two. Well, in a very young democracy, such as I imagine Thebes to have been in the 370s, they probably hadn't quite worked out a system of checks and balances as the Athenians had. And so it's very clear that, as your questioner implies, Pelopidas and Epaminondas were kept on a pretty short chain, and they rarely actually collaborated physically. In other words, they weren't in the same theatre of conflict at the same time, probably except when in battle, at the famous Battle of Leuctra. And by 362, the Battle of Mantinea, Pelopidas was dead. He died in Thessaly. He was trying to intervene in a diplomatic matter where a local Thessalian ruler was being rather unpleasant to the Thebans and the Boeotians, and Pelopidas got killed. He got sucked into that. Epaminondas died as a result of his wounds wounds at the Battle of Mycenaean 362. So he didn't outlive this golden decade either. So it does seem that both Epaminondas and Pelopidas were put on trial. And whether or not they were actually fined, they weren't severely enough disabled by the punishment to prevent them playing the leading role. And Epaminondas in particular, he led 4 invasions of the Peloponnese. The most important, the biggest, the most successful, the most decisive was the first, and that was in the winter of 370-369, the one that liberated the Mycenaean Helots and defeated the Spartans, well, stripped it of half their territory straight away.
I'm going to try and amalgamate a few questions here relating broadly to archaeology and myth, but I'll just, before I do that, endorse your own endorsement of the new Thebes Museum. It's a spectacular collection and a wonderful place, and I urge everyone who hasn't visited, including yourself, to go and visit it as soon as it becomes possible. So the questions really are around the match, if you like, between the archaeology of Thebes and the literary references, and that sort of slightly odd picture that we have of the Thebes, odd in relation to our later view of the city, as appearing in the catalogue of ships when there's no real reason to mention Thebes at all. So how consistent do you think the archaeology of Thebes is with the Homeric picture and the other sort of pictures of the mythological pictures of Thebes?
Well, I would put it rather the other way round, that suppose I was doing a Mycenaean geographically based catalogue of ships, and there's an argument that it is genuinely based, as opposed to invented or an amalgamation of the situation in terms of population and inhabitation of several different periods, sort of just mingled together by a succession of poets. If Thebes was as important as the archaeology says it was, and so was Orchomenos, why was there not a Theban, as it were, Diomedes, who famously sits alongside Agamemnon of Mycenae, Menelaus of Sparta? Why was there not a terrific champion from Boeotia? Now, well, I'm not alone in this. A former student of mine has actually just published, or is about to publish, a book on this very point. I see a systematic denigration in the Homeric, Ionic tradition of the Iliad, the Aegean, in other words, not a mainland Greek tradition, not a central mainland or northern mainland Greek, apart from Achilles in Thessaly, a systematic denigration of Thebes, which is referred to in the catalogue as hypo Thebai, under Thebes, as if let's forget about the Kadmos. Let's just think about those Thebans who lived underneath the Kadmos. Orchomenos is there in its own right. And if you add up all the ships that Boeotian cities collectively contribute, well, their collective contribution in the catalogue of the ships is second only to Mycenae, to the great lord of Mycenae rich in gold, Agamemnon. So there's something funny going on here. And one suggestion is, since Thebes was really important in the Bronze Age, when we agree many of the, quotes, historic myths of historical Greece get formulated first, why does it not have a strong showing in the mythological period, as it were, the imagined late Bronze Age, mythical age? Well, possibly it was simply jealousy of the poets of the tradition that ultimately eventuated in the Iliad on the one hand, and then on the other side, you've got, of course, the Odyssey, which is Western Greece. So Boeotia falls between Achilles and his Myrmidons, Agamemnon and his men, and Menelaus and so on, and on the other side, the Odyssey of Odysseus. So they could literally have squeezed out the Theban epic tradition, of which, by the way, there were 4 well-known once epics, 4 Theban epics, and they're of course the source ultimately of Kadmos, of Oedipus, of Pentheus, or is it Tentheus, and so on and so on. So something funny is going on.
About the sacred topography of Thebes. One questioner wonders if you could say a little more about it, and if there's anything that makes it distinct from or paradigmatic of other Greek polis. And related to that is the association of monuments with particular mythological events, and whether you think the ancient Thebans would have moved around their city and identified those places with events from their myth.
No, very good question. The walls, obviously, 7 against Thebes and so on. But may I start at the end, really, with the destruction of the city, a point I didn't mention in my talk. When Alexander ordered Thebes physically to be destroyed, he made 2 exceptions. One was for the house in which Pindar was thought, indeed probably did, live 140 odd years earlier. Why should he exempt that house, which was then lived in by Pindar's descendants, from the general destruction of all secular structures? Because he was the Epameinondas, the praise poet of victors in the 4 major pan-Hellenic games, the circuit as it was called, the Olympics, the Pythians, the Nemeans and the Isthmians. And therefore he was, as it were, at the period when his fellow citizens were being traitors, he was a glorious exception to that rule because he stood for all Greekness through the particular victors that he celebrated the victories of at those particular, the 4 major Pan-Hellenic games. The other generic exception was for all religious shrines, and Alexander was what probably the ancients would have called superstitious, daimon. That word was coined in Alexander's lifetime by actually a pupil of Aristotle, and Aristotle had been Alexander's own tutor when Alexander was an early teenager. So Alexander was extremely religious, pious, and one might say superstitious. And he didn't want the gods, the Greek gods, to be against him when he set off for Asia. So the other exception, physically, was the non-destruction of all shrines and any buildings within. The religious repertoire of the Thebans is not really particularly exceptional. In other words, Apollo, Heracles, of course, having started out as a semi-divine, only his mum was mortal, his dad was Zeus. He then gets elevated to Olympus, so he becomes an Olympian by association, by adoption. But Athena is another one of the Theban pantheon. This is absolutely standard. Apollo, Heracles, Athena, but then add Dionysus, and he's another one whose mum was Theban. And so he is thought to be particularly important for the Thebans to worship. But in terms of whether or not the questioner asked, is there any association, did a Theban, as he went about his daily life, said that was where Oedipus put his eyes out, or it was that gate that this particular one of the epigonoi, the later group of 7, there were 2 groups of 7 against Thebes, attacked, or that was where Eteocles was laid out for feast for the dogs and the carrion outside the gates of Thebes, as in Antigone. One can't say, obviously, but it's generically true, I think, of all Greeks that they associated space and place with myth. So everything has its mythical backdrop or counterpart in story. However, there is, I think, a sense in which once Thebes was rebuilt 315, re-inhabited, and they excavate because it's been in ruins, you know, weeds had grown up, and you have to actually dig new foundations, build new houses. Well, they did periodically unearth monuments from pre-335 Thebes. And so there, for example, they would dig up what they took to be a statue of Epaminondas, for example, or it might be a statue of Heracles. And then they would dedicate a shrine there to that particular. So there is a sense in which the sacred topography of post-315, the new Thebes, does indeed reflect the intimate connection between monumentality and mythical space.
A couple of comments, not questions, but from the side that Hesiod might be good evidence of epic going on in Boeotia, but don't know whether you want to comment on that. Or...
Well, Hesiod famously was thought to be, as Herodotus put it, he and Homer between them identified what and who the gods were, assigned them their functions, and through his theogony, Hesiod, as it were, I mean, it's a very inexact comparison, created a sort of genesis, good Greek word, for the Greek gods and heroes and the ancestors in heroic lore and legend of physically their descendants, the contemporaries of Hesiod circa 700. Hesiod himself was a foreigner, you know, his dad was an immigrant from Asia Minor and settled in Asgra, which was a village within the purview of what became the city of Thespiae, which is, of course, near the Valley of the Muses, and Hesiod is very keen on identifying the Muses, as indeed were the poets of the Iliad, as their inspiration. So Hesiod is a Boeotian, but not a Theban, and of course he does write lots and lots of, not epic, in epic meter, but not in our sense of daring do stories, but one of the things attributed to him is a work called The Shield of Heracles, which of course is a kind of parallel or mirror of the shield of Achilles in the Iliad. And which came first, who knows? And anyway, the attribution to Hesiod is somewhat dubious. So Hesiod was thought to have written something called Catalogue of Women. So there's lots of mythological personages scattered in the pages, the lines of Hesiod, but not an epic tradition of the sort that I'd been meaning to refer to when I talked about the 4 Theban epics and about the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Okay, time is running a little bit short, so we have a couple more questions. One about the sanctuary of the Kabirion, yep, which is close to Thebes. Does this give any specific insights into the religious life of Thebes, considering that the worship of the Kabiri was a mystic cult and the other 2 known sanctuaries were in the northeastern corner of the Aegean?
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle. Why? They're thought to be, aren't they, broadly Oriental in origin, and the most famous one is in Samothrace, right up in the northern Aegean. And they're particularly amusing, I suppose, to us, because there is a Theban take. I mean, there's a famous pot of Odysseus, a pot showing Odysseus with Circe. And of course, in the Odyssey, Odysseus doesn't come out entirely brilliantly in his interactions with Circe or Circe. And therefore, I think the Theban artist who drew that, it's a characteristic manner of painting. So the shape of the pots and the black on white style, a technique, is associated, it's called a Kabarian style. I think the artist took great pleasure in having a laugh at Odysseus from his Boeotian Kabarian perspective. But more seriously, apart from these dedications, you went to that shrine to be initiated in the mystery cult of the Kabaroi, or sometimes it's actually called Kabaros. Sometimes the dedications are made to a singular kabaros. So it's a little bit puzzling. We have, of course, no systematic account by Boeotian of what the cult was like, or why one would want to become initiated, how one went about it, unlike what we have for Athens for the Eleusinian mysteries. We don't even have all that negative Christian stuff about the Eleusinian mysteries that the Christians, once Greece went Christian, they so hated about the pagan mysteries. But there we are. They obviously fulfilled a certain need for some sort of identification with another sort of life beyond the everyday. Typically, when you're initiated, you take on a new persona, and so your Kabaran mystic persona is not your everyday Boeotian persona.
Question about, given the rich mythological tradition in Thebes, which inspired Athenian dramatic poets, is there any evidence about theatrical performance in Thebes itself?
Only by inference. Where did Pronomos learn his craft? Well, we happen to know that he came from a family of Aulitai. So his dad was also a skilled Aulites. And what were they playing for? In what context was the aulos used? Well, we happen to know in Athens, it was used to mark time when you were rowing in a trireme. So there was a member of the supernumerary crew on a trireme in the Athenian navy who was called a triiraules or triiraulos, sometimes also aulites. So the instrument has a function outside the theatre. The Spartans, a very interesting passage in Thucydides, book 5, chapter 70, he says they marched to take up their station in battle to the accompaniment of auloi. Now, many people, he says, think this is religious. It isn't. It's purely functional, and it has the same function as the triiraules has on an Athenian trireme to enable the Spartans to keep in step. And that's, of course, crucial when you're mustering, you're about to attack in a hoplite, heavy armed infantry. Well, the Thebans could have used the aulos for that military function for training hoplites. But to my knowledge, there's not a strong theatrical tradition. Some would say the Kabarian scenes actually represent sort of masks, sort of, I don't mean MASKS, but MASQUES, the sorts of burlesques of mythical scenes. So the Odysseus and Circe image could have been, as it were, a scene from a little play at the Kabarion. But in Thebes itself, there was a theatre, for sure, but I don't think we have evidence for anything worked up in the form of a dramatic performance in the way that Athens was famous for, and which was then exported in particular to South Italy, as I mentioned.
Well, I think we'll make this one the last question. It's been sitting in front of me for a little while now. Dying to know, is it likely that Epaminondas was a vegetarian, as has been suggested?
Well, yes, I mean, if he was a Pythagorean adept, in other words, he is said to be keen on Pythagorean philosophy and Pythagoreanism, because it believed in the transmigration of souls such that, and then this is the joke, of course, that it might be you're eating a bean and it's actually got someone else's soul in it, maybe even your own ancestor, so how terrible. Well, Pythagoreans and Orphics, another marginal group in North Greece, but not only North Greece, but that's where the famous Derveni tablets have come from. Pythagoreans start out in South Italy, Croton, that's where Pythagoras from Samos migrates to, and forms a community of which he was a kind of guru, and his life was told much later on and his memory lived on. But anyway, supposing Epaminondas was a thoroughgoing Pythagorean adept, the answer would be yes. And I've always rather found it amusing, but in a way sad too. If you're a vegetarian in modern Greece, if you're a Greek vegetarian, or at least were, maybe no longer you are, but used to be labeled a hortophagos, an eater of wild greens, not cultivated greens. So I'm assuming, I'm inferring the word originally doesn't have a wholly positive flavor to it. Anyway, he may very well have been.
Well, thank you very much once again, Paul, and thank everyone for their participation and for listening. If you want to, I know we haven't answered everyone's questions. I'm very happy for you to send those to the email address that you should have received in correspondence about this event. That's webinars@bsa.ac.uk. I'll ask Paul to move on to the next slide, please. But and with Paul's permission, I will forward those to him, and he can take his time about answering them and so on. But thank you once again very much to all of you for attending. Thank you to Paul for a wonderful lecture and for a wonderful set of responses to the questions. I'm leaving you with a reminder of our web address if you want to come and find out more about us. And we're also on Facebook and Twitter and some of the digital resources that are available to you through our website. But thank you once again, and stay safe. Good evening, good morning to all of you.
Yassas.